They told you to love with all your heart, to be soft, patient, and generous, to give without keeping score, thinking that if you are kind enough, the world won't hurt you. But Machiavelli never believed in this. He didn't see love as salvation. Instead, he saw it as a crack in the armor, a blind spot in your strategy, an opening wide enough for betrayal to slip through. When you lead with emotion, logic takes a back seat, and those who understand this dynamic can weaponize your love. Love is not inherently evil, but love doesn't calculate, and the world does. A man who depends on love will be destroyed by it, not because love is wrong, but because love is not strategic. Love alone doesn't defend against the harshness of life. It leaves you vulnerable, making you susceptible to being taken advantage of. You may love your family, friends, or your partner deeply. You may believe that if you always forgive, if you give without question, if you're patient enough, everything will work out. But Machiavelli would tell you this: you're living in a fantasy. Love without boundaries leaves you exposed. When you give love without structure, you hand your power away. It's time to change. Become cold-blooded, but not without love. Be a man who loves with strategy and discipline. No longer beg to be loved back, but rather, love with a plan, with clarity. Stage 1. When love blinds. At first, it starts small. A delayed reply, a lack of the attention you once received, an unexpected distance. But you don't see it, because when you love someone deeply, you don't observe them. You project your ideal version of them onto the situation. You forgive flaws that should be questioned because you're so invested in maintaining the fantasy. You stop paying attention to red flags because you want comfort, not truth. Here is Machiavelli's insight. He who builds his defense on love alone builds on sand. The moment you lead with love, you lose control. You stop watching the board of your life and begin allowing others to make moves without your permission. They learn your forgiveness is automatic, your presence is guaranteed, your patience is endless. This familiarity breeds entitlement, not love. What you freely give is no longer valued, it's taken for granted. Machiavelli warned that when you make yourself too available, people stop valuing your presence. You go from being someone cherished to someone used. This is not cruelty. It's simply human nature. People tend to exploit what they don't have to earn. Ask yourself, when was the last time you stayed silent to avoid an argument? Or apologized, even when you weren't at fault? This isn't love. This is self-abandonment. You need to love with boundaries, clarity, and structure. Love that has no discipline becomes exposure. Stage 2. The price of leading with emotion. You thought that being open, being patient, and forgiving made you strong, but it didn't. What you didn't see was that every time you silenced your voice to avoid conflict, every time you compromised your own needs to keep the peace, you were draining yourself. Machiavelli would say, emotion is the leash they use to drag your power behind their pleasure. Leading with emotion without strategy leads to self-erasure. You give your time, your patience, and your energy without ever asking for anything in return. You forgive automatically because you hope to preserve the peace. But what happens when you stop enforcing your boundaries? The game doesn't end. They start winning. You think you're avoiding conflict, but silence without consequence is simply submission. It leaves a vacuum that is filled with manipulation, where your needs go unheard and your boundaries are ignored. Time doesn't fix disrespect, it cements it. Machiavelli's principle is, when your forgiveness becomes predictable, it will be used before it's appreciated. In a world where people expect forgiveness and loyalty without earning it, you must draw your boundaries clearly. The moment you say no and they push, that's when they start to see the man you've become. They won't respect you until they feel the consequences of crossing your line. And that's when you know you're reclaiming your power. Stage 3. When you stop playing, they start winning. You didn't hand over your power all at once. It started small. Every time you said yes when you wanted to say no, every time you kept quiet when you should have spoken, every time you forgave without an apology, you unknowingly surrendered. Machiavelli would call it unstrategic surrender. By failing to enforce your boundaries, you became predictable. And once you're predictable, you're easily controlled. The moment you stop drawing the line, they start rewriting the rules. And before you know it, you're the one being played. Forgiveness is not a virtue if it's offered without consequence. Machiavelli warned that loyalty without leverage is a weakness. Stop allowing guilt and emotional pressure to replace your logic and self-respect. Time doesn't fix broken boundaries. It cements them. You must choose not to be a doormat. Stage 4. The illusion of peace. They told you to avoid conflict, to keep the peace, to smile through discomfort. They told you that silence was noble, but the truth is, silence without consequence is submission. What you thought was peace was actually a slow erosion of your standards. You kept swallowing your truth, thinking it would lead to harmony, but it led to your gradual self-destruction. Machiavelli would have warned you. There is no peace without respect, and no loyalty without fear. You sacrificed your peace to protect their comfort, and they didn't love you for it. They loved the version of you that tolerated everything. The truth is, your silence was never peace. It was submission. And now you must reclaim your power by drawing a line. Stop apologizing for it. Stop apologizing for enforcing your standards. Let them feel discomfort when you stop shrinking. Stage 5. Love with boundaries to bar they cut. You were told to love unconditionally, to keep giving and forgiving. But no one warned you that love without boundaries would be abused. When love is freely given, it becomes invisible. When it is unprotected, it gets drained. You weren't loving. You were leaking. You were constantly pouring pieces of yourself into places that would never hold you. Machiavelli understood this. He didn't tell men to stop loving. He told them to structure their love, to protect it with boundaries, standards, and clarity. Love without protection isn't love. It's exposure. Ask yourself, how many times have you apologized just to stop someone else's emotional meltdown? How many times have you shrunk yourself to make someone else comfortable? That's not love. It's manipulation. It's emotional pressure disguised as intimacy. You don't have to stop loving, but you need to refine it. Set boundaries. Protect your heart. When you say no, do they respect it? Or do they try to cross the line louder? You're not here to be emotionally available on demand. You're here to be in command of your emotional availability. Stage 6. Fearless love is a weak man's religion. They told you to love without fear, but fearless love isn't noble. It's naive. Real strength is never blind. The moment you love without fear, you become pliable, predictable. And predictability is death in a world governed by perception. Machiavelli would have laughed at this notion, because when you love without fear, you become easy to control. You vanish into your giving. They take your love without ever giving back. And when you run dry, they don't grieve. They just refill elsewhere. Fearless love doesn't make you stronger. It makes you disposable. The real truth is, you must love wisely, with caution and clarity. Build your love with boundaries. Protect your heart. Love without giving away your power. Stage 7. The final shift, from emotion to authority. This is the final shift, the transition from emotional reaction to strategic authority. The man who used to live by emotion, who sought approval, is gone. He's been replaced by the man who sets boundaries, who knows his worth. Machiavelli's wisdom teaches us that power doesn't belong to the kindest man. It belongs to the most calculated one. The one who knows exactly when to withdraw, when to act, and when to draw the line. This is the man you are becoming, someone who doesn't negotiate his worth. From this moment forward, you don't beg, you don't chase, you don't explain. You act with precision. You control your emotional availability. The game never stopped. You just stopped playing by their rules. Now you make your own. Final words. You owe no one your softness. You've heard the truth now. It was never about love. It was about obedience. And you were never meant to be obedient. You were meant to be strategic. Set your boundaries. Reclaim your worth. The version of you who gave everything away just to be chosen. That version is dead. What remains is the man who chooses himself first. You no longer chase love, you command it. And that is the first step toward true power.